Okay, today we're going to talk about cerebral edema. This is essentially an increase of fluid in the cranial vault, usually in the brain tissue itself. This fluid can be increased extracellular or increased intracellular tissue, which causes the brain to expand, push against the sides of the skull, and increase cranial pressure. This usually is going to occur generally when you have some kind of insult to the brain, whether it comes from trauma or infection, ischemia, tumor, anything like that that would cause the brain to begin to absorb or keep cellular fluid. We have three different types of cerebral edema: vasogenic, cytotoxic, and interstitial. Interstitial edema is essentially associated with some kind of an obstruction in the flow of cerebral spinal fluid, whether it's in the ventricles or in the track that cerebral spinal fluid takes as it leaves the brain and goes down the spinal cord. This is going to result in increased cranial pressure because the blockage is causing that fluid to back up and cause the brain then itself to swell. Vasogenic edema, this is caused by increased vascular permeability, particularly at the capillaries. Inside the white matter of the brain, these vessels are leaking. We've got those leaky vessels again. And when those vessels leak, they basically leak fluid into the white matter, causing that white matter to swell. And again, we're going to push against the walls of the skull and cause that increased pressure. Cytotoxic edema is a failure of our sodium-potassium pump. Essentially what happens is, instead of sodium moving back outside of the cell after it's moved in, it doesn't get shunted back out. And so now we have sodium inside the cell. And remember, wherever salt goes, water follows. So as sodium is moving into the cell and staying there, so is water. And water then is going to accumulate and cause then this increase in fluid, which is then going to cause the brain to swell. Oops, I'm sorry. There we go. Some of the symptoms are going to develop, and they're going to develop very rapidly. The most important one is increased cranial pressure. The more pressure that is put onto the brain tissue and the longer it sits, the more likely you're going to have permanent damage to the brain and other neural tissues. You do have the potential for the deterioration into coma, and once that happens, prognosis is not very good for recovery. Treatment is going to include a diagnosis based on physical examination and a CT and or MRI, so that they can get a good picture of the brain and see where is the swelling coming from. Do we have a blockage? Is it some kind of cerebral spinal fluid issue? In certain instances, you may need some kind of surgery to relieve that intracranial pressure. Other conditions of cerebral edema are going to include something called hydrocephalus. This is caused by an increase of cerebral spinal fluid in the brain tissue. You have what is called communicating and non-communicating hydrocephalus. Non-communicating hydrocephalus we usually see in children. This is usually caused by some kind of obstruction in the ventricle system that moves the cerebral spinal fluid. That obstruction then causes fluid to back up, which leads to increased cranial pressure, increased cranial size, and you end up then with hydrocephalus. Communicating usually is in adults. This is usually due to a decrease absorption of cerebral spinal fluid. Treatment for both of these may require surgical insertion of a shunt to move that cerebral spinal fluid back through, so it's continuing to move through and absorb back into the tissues. Other types of edema are called herniations. And herniations are displacement of brain tissue due to that intracranial pressure. There are a number of different ones, but I want to talk about the two major herniations. The first one is called an uncall. This is where the medial part of the temporal lobe will herniate through an opening called the tentorium cerebelli. The tentorium cerebelli is essentially a place where the cerebrum and the cerebellum meet. There's an opening between the two. We have a a, a bony prominence here that comes through, and we have an opening, and the cerebrum then will herniate into the region where the cerebellum is. The second one is called a tonsillar herniation, and this is where the cerebellum herniates through the magnum foramen. And so you can have the brain matter actually coming out of the cranial vault into the spinal cord area. Okay, that's it for cerebral edema. Please send me your questions, and we'll keep going.